Welcome back, everybody, to pixelprojectradio. This is take 2 of an intro on the game today. Welcome back. This is a video game discussion-style podcast where we talk all about the games that we love and some that you love, too. It's me, it's Rick, your host. I'm not a Game Boy, I'm a game man. And today, we are talking all about Nintendo's Game Boy. That's right, the original Game Boy, and we're going to talk about some of the future generations, too. Well, it's all in the past now, but future at the time. You get it? It's clear as mud. You'll be fine. And with me today, I have got two absolute superstars as far as the guests go. And I'm going to go in alphabetical order of first name because that just happens to be how they're appearing on my screen right now. First up, we've got the returning king of the handhelds himself. Got a nice little CRT set up behind him, too. We've got Alex from Low 5 Gaming. How's it going, man?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me back on, Rick. I'm super excited to talk about the Game Boy. It is one of my favorite things ever.
Absolutely. I think if you're of a certain age group, everybody had a Game Boy. And part of our age group and part of our Discord call right now is the second man of the hour. He is the host of Tales from the Backlog and one of the co-hosts of a Top 3 podcast and a certified dude. We've got Dave Jackson. Dave, welcome back to the show.
That is the highest honor that I could receive, a certified dude. Is there a ceremony? Is this the ceremony?
You know, there are ceremonies, but we can't talk about it on air. It's secret.
That's true. That's true. I don't want to violate any codes or anything. Thanks for having me back on, Rick.
Hey, man, the pleasure is all mine. It's great to have both of you here. The Game Boy was obviously a huge cultural phenomenon, and the three of us were all in the age range that got swept up in this massively successful handheld. And we're going to talk about it. Just a quick social plug reminder. We're going to do all of the plugging at the end of the show. We'll do it before we do the listener responses. So stick around so you can hear about all of our Instagrams, Twitters, Discords, etc., etc. Now, let's get started. I wanted to talk to you two about your histories with the Game Boy. We can go in reverse order this time and start with Dave. Dave, when did you get your first Game Boy? Do you have any really fond memories with the device? Tell me a little bit about how you were introduced to this little dude.
Yeah, absolutely. So before the Game Boy, I had a Game Gear. That was the only gaming thing I owned. Before then, that was the first. And then for Christmas in 1998, I got a Game Boy Pocket with Pokemon Red. And that was, as they say, the beginning of the end, right? So that's the first memory, is getting the Game Boy Pocket with Pokemon Red. My brother and I played the absolute shit out of Pokemon together, and then it just spun into all sorts of different other games for the Game Boy that I'm sure we'll talk about when we get into, each iteration of the Game Boy. But I went on to get all the iterations we're going to talk about today: the Color, the Advance SP, had them all basically. Even had a friend in elementary school from Japan who had that cool Game Boy Light. We were all super jealous of him.
Oh, man.
So this was a giant part of my childhood. It's probably, we got the N64 the next year for Christmas, but I can pretty confidently say that I liked playing my Game Gear. The Game Boy was the device that turned me into, a lifelong lover of video games.
Hell yeah, man. And two things that you said in there, a family member and Pokemon, those are two huge factors that swept a lot of people up in the Game Boy craze. And I'm sure we'll get more into that as we talk more about our histories with it. Alex, how about you, man? Tell me a little bit about your history with the Game Boy.
So I was trying to think earlier today when it really started, because I don't recall exactly. I have one of the big boy Game Boys, the DMG, the original, that I still have today, and I still play it occasionally, although that screen doesn't quite hold up. But I was trying to remember when I got that, and I know, so I grew up in a household that didn't really, they weren't anti-video games, but we just didn't have any video games. We didn't have any video game systems. My parents didn't really, that wasn't their thing. But eventually we ended up getting them, kind of whittled them down. And the thing that kind of broke the seal was the DMG Game Boy. But I don't know to this day exactly how I got it. I know I borrowed a few of them from friends and would play all the time. Very fond memories of sitting on the chair in my living room and just playing hours and hours of certain games. But I don't know. I don't know how that my DMG came to me. But it's been here ever since. But then, like Dave, I did get a Pokemon. I got Pokemon Red in 1998, and I was about 12 years old at the time. And that was gifted to me by a friend's mom who bought both he and I the new pockets and the version blue and red of Pokemon. So she got him blue, and I got to have the red one. And that was when that's for sure when I remember a Game Boy entering my household and was given to me at that time. And then at some point I got the color, and then in high school I bought the Advance, and the rest is history.
Hey, look, I think all of us at one point or another have had an original DMG Game Boy just show up with no explanation. Yeah. It's practically a rite of passage for being a dude.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Clickhole, if you're listening, I'm available. Anyways. So it feels a little weird talking about what a Game Boy is, but just in case there are folks listening that don't know, what is the Game Boy? Well, the original Game Boy was an 8-bit 4th generation handheld game console developed and manufactured by, that's right, Nintendo. Thanks, Wikipedia.
Okie dokie. Ho ho.
So anybody that hasn't seen one of these original Game Boys, how would you guys describe them? I mean, they're chonky sons of guns, right?
Oh, you stole the words right out of my mouth. They are definitely chonky.
Yeah, I was going to use the word brick. That's if you had one word to describe, other than chonky, because that works too. The brick. That's how my friends and I always referred to the original Game Boy as, oh, which kind of Game Boy did you have? I had the brick. Oh, okay, I gotcha. I understand.
Yeah, I've heard brick. We also would call it the toaster version.
It's funny, just the other week, as of recording this, I walked into my local retro store and they had like a pristine original, like big fat boy Game Boy. And I picked it up and it's great. The unfortunate thing is next week they had another pristine one with a modded screen, with an IPS screen. So that's a bit of a bummer because as Alex mentioned, the screens on these things back in the day, they were rough, man. I mean, these kids today, they don't realize, like, you had to get that thing just right under the light. And if you were playing in the back seat while you were driving, man, that was like Russian roulette. You never knew if you're going to see what's on the screen or not.
Yeah. Nintendo didn't get the screen on the Game Boy right until like 2006 or whenever the SP came out.
Right. The Pocket was a nice upgrade, though, with the contrast, and it went to, more of the... what would you call it? It went from that like green blur that you had to deal with to being more monochrome, and the contrast was a lot better. But, you mentioned earlier the Game Boy Light, Dave. That didn't come out in the U.S. It was Japan only, and that was my holy grail. I became a collector more seriously in, around 2018, 2019, and that was my grail for the longest time, but I don't know, one of these days.
They're tough to come by, man. I don't think I've ever seen one in person.
Yeah, the only one I've ever seen in person was, again, a kid from Japan had one, and he was understandably the coolest kid in class during that time.
Absolutely, man. You were royalty if you had fancy Game Boy stuff.
Uh-huh.
Let's talk a little bit about how this thing came to be, huh? So this was originally released in 1989 in Japan and the United States, and 1990 in Europe. This was in production until 2003. I did not know that.
The original one, the brick, until 2003?
As far as I could find, I didn't do enough research to figure out if that was when it was officially discontinued or if that's when the last new stock that was reported was sold. It's probably the latter. I can't imagine this was not discontinued until 2003, but even still, regardless of which one that is, that's pretty damn impressive.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. price, and now we're getting into this, I found some fascinating info that I'm really excited to talk about. The U.S. price for the original Game Boy at the time was $90. And thanks to the CPI inflation calculator, courtesy of the Bureau of Labor Statistics here in the United States, we found all of these in current day dollars. $90 in 1989, 1990 in the U.S. is roughly equivalent to $219.12 of today's money. That's nuts to me.
Yeah, that's pretty damn cheap.
What?
Depending on who you talk to.
I mean, pretty like what
I think it's worth it.
handheld thing is coming out now for $219 that can actually run its own games, is not like a cloud gaming machine, you know? It's pretty cheap.
I suppose you're right. I think you'll be with me on these next price points though, because I did a little digging and I wanted to compare the original Game Boy to its two biggest competitors of the time, the Sega Game Gear and the Atari Lynx. Now, yeah, Dave, I know you have experience with the Game Gear. It was your introduction to video games, as you've said. Alex, do you have a Game Gear?
I did have a Game Gear. So I didn't have one growing up, but one of my good buddies that lived across the alley from me did. So I borrowed it all the time. Battery life on those things, not too good.
Yep, not great.
You can plug into the wall. That said, I bought a Game Gear maybe last year from a buddy that I work with, but I ended up selling it. Don't tell him. But to help justify the cost of my Analog Pocket, which is a Game Boy-esque machine that's made by the company Analog. We don't have to get in the weeds too much on FPGA and all that stuff, but it's a pretty fancy, cool system that costs $220. So that doesn't sound too expensive anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good luck for finding an Analog Pocket for $220 right now. That's all I'll say.
Yeah, resale no good.
But that's the Sega Game Gear. We've also got the Atari Lynx. The Lynx came out in late 89. The Game Gear came out in 1990. And here is the price breakdown of the two of those. The Sega Game Gear, the initial price when it dropped, $150. Current money, current day's time, that would equal $345.78. Now, if you think that's wild, the Atari Lynx, when it first dropped, $180. Today's money, $438.25. So right away, we see Nintendo coming out with the Game Boy at an incredibly competitive price. And history with the glasses, the retroactive glasses of history, we all know the Game Boy was the winner here, right? The Game Boy continued, whereas the Game Gear and the Lynx died out. And it wasn't just because of price. The performance to price ratio is important to talk about too. The original Game Boy compared to the Lynx and the Game Gear was actually less powerful and less enticing to folks that were looking for those high specs. It did not produce color, whereas those two did, and it was just generally not as powerful. But the Game Gear, I don't know about the Lynx, I assume this is similar, but the Game Gear took 6 AA batteries, a total of 6 of them, and the battery life on those things were abysmal. The Game Boy might have been underpowered in terms of like raw CPU processing power, but the battery life on those things, and they took 4 AA batteries, by the way, was much, much better. It's down later in the notes. I don't see it right now, but I believe it's somewhere around 10 hours of battery life, I believe. 15 hours, I found it. 15 hours roughly. Just blew the Game Gear and the Lynx out of the water. So we've got the battery performance and we've got the price, but also the form factor. I don't know. I don't know about you guys, but I don't think it's a contest as to which looks the best out of these three.
Yeah, I mean, looking the best, I guess a little bit subjective. I think the Game Boy looks good, but the form factor as far as like holding it, and especially if you're a kid, holding it, the Game Gear was big and it was chunky, and if you dropped it, you would be worried about dropping that thing. The Game Boy, perfect for kids. It's bad for me as an adult person with adult hands, but it's perfect for kids. So it makes sense in that way too.
Yeah, it's hard to go back in time and think about, how it looked maybe at the time and how it was received. I do think that Nintendo did a really good job nailing it. That said, I mean, the big chunky thing. It is kind of weird, but it fits I'm a big chunky dude too. So I got big hands. So it fits my hands at the time. I guess I didn't, but I tell you what, the great one, I think it's iconic. And I think that is like plays a big fact because of that, like, because it's iconic. I think today I look at it and I go, oh, this looks great. But I don't think it was until the Play It Loud colors that I thought it was really sexy,
Oh yeah. Those were some nice colors. I want to camp out on the form factor just a little bit more, though. We keep calling this thing chonky. We call it a big boy. We call it a wide load. We call it. I'm not going to keep going. I'm sorry. But we call it. We laugh at it because it's a fat thing, right? If you compare it to the Lynx, especially, but also the Game Gear, it is significantly smaller. And given its horizontal form factor given its vertical form factor geez Louise, you make one mistake and they just keep coming. Given its vertical form factor as opposed to the Lynx and the Game Gear's horizontal form factors meant that it was, at least in theory, pocketable. That's kind of laughable, like looking at it like these days. Like I'm looking at the thing on my shelf and I can't imagine stuffing that into my jeans. But Jinko jeans were big in the 90s.
Yeah.
But the point is that form factor wise, I think they were more forward thinking. The Lynx is enormous and the screen to body ratio is so hilarious by today's standards. The Game Gear was kind of in the middle. It's still a big boy. You ain't fitting that thing in any pockets. I don't care what kind of brands you wear. So I think that combined with the battery power, combined with the price, I mean, Nintendo had the formula for success down pat.
Totally. I think it's interesting. You brought it up earlier, Rick, that, not only with the form factor and the looking at it all, but you brought up the specs. Like the specs weren't crazy, especially compared to a couple of the other things on the market. But what's interesting is that I think that was a very deliberate choice by Nintendo because it allowed developers to easily make games for this thing, right? So that also contributes to the success of the Game Boy because you have a pretty simple system that developers it's really approachable, right? So the biggest problem wasn't trying to figure out how to make games for this system. It was trying to figure out how to get all their ideas to fit on one of those little cartridges.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Speaking of like what they were thinking of as developers at the time, this product, like while it was being developed, actually did not have a good reputation. There was a lot of infighting between teams. I didn't really get a chance to look into that too deeply, but internally, this thing was not received well. It actually, I found, and I thought this was pretty funny, it earned the nickname Dame Boy. Dame in Japanese roughly translates to like no good, unacceptable, foolish, useless, etc. Any Yakuza fan, Dave's laughing, any Yakuza fan is familiar with this word.
It's the best karaoke song in the series.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you think that I'm not putting that in, you're crazy. Speaking of games, though, this Game Boy, this product, was bundled with one of the most popular games of all time. It was bundled with a port of Tetris.
Yes.
I logged serious hours on Game Boy Tetris and Game Boy Tetris DX over the years. It is nuts. I played the original Game Boy Tetris as recently as last week. I'm not even joking.
I love it. That's I have. Oh man, I don't know. I've got my numbers written down somewhere, but I have a ton of Game Boy games, and Tetris is the one that gets pulled out the most. It's just so easy to pick up and play. Something
that I found, speaking of Tetris, is that it actually came bundled with the system at the insistence of one Hank Rogers to Nintendo of America president of the time, Minoru Arakawa. Possibly a large factor in the success of the Game Boy. Speculation, of course, but I think so.
Yeah, there's a fun movie out right now, Tetris, the Tetris movie.
Right.
I think it's on Apple TV with, I believe his name's Taron Egerton. But it's fun. It's a dramatization. It's quite over the top, but it's a lot of fun, and it's there's bits of history in there as well. But without Tetris, Game Boy might not be as big as it is today.
Yeah, Nintendo seems to do well with these pack-in games with their systems, right? I mean, look, with the benefit of hindsight, of course, it's a no-brainer to put Tetris in there. Tetris is like one of the most approachable games. If you're buying a Game Boy, you can play Tetris, and who doesn't like Tetris, right? Good first impression.
Shout out to my co-host Luke, who hates Tetris.
Ah, jeez, Luke again. God damn that guy.
I can't believe this.
But he's out of his mind. It's one of the best games ever.
Listen, Luke, I want you to know right now, I'm speaking to you directly. I just have one question for you, buddy. What are you doing? Who are you, Luke?
I'll note too. It's interesting. I hear a lot of discourse about the Nintendo Wii, right? So the Nintendo Wii, a lot of folks will attribute its success to the fact that it was so approachable to a multitude of age ranges, right? So you got your Nintendo Wii's in the old folks' home. You got your grandparents playing the Wii or whatever. Wii Sports, whatever it is. And then you look back at the Game Boy and you think about Tetris. That's such an approachable game for all age ranges as well. So I also have fond memories of going to my godmother and my Aunt Sue's house to hang out, and she had a Game Boy, and she had the Game Boy for two reasons: Tetris and Link's Awakening. And she would let me play both those games. I have very fond memories of those. But it's wild to me to think back that my Aunt Sue had a Game Boy, and it was purely for those games. And she's just not a demo I would have thought would love the Game Boy.
It's interesting that you say that because my grandma was also aware of games, and she knew what a Game Boy was. I don't think she ever played it, but my mom and my aunt had Game Boys, and they would play Super Mario Land 1 or I don't think it was Contra, but it was something similar to Contra or Pac-Man, obviously, things like that. And it's just wild, man. I mean, you don't see it as often these days, but gaming, especially that era, the Atari, ColecoVision, things like that, they were in some ways more ubiquitous than games are today. I mean, not quite, obviously, but in some ways, I don't know. It's pretty cool. Game Boy, though, we still have a little bit to talk about just in terms of the raw numbers and facts and figures and all that jazz. This was designed by the same fella that designed the Game & Watch, was Nintendo's chief engineer of the time, Gunpei Yokoi, and of course Nintendo's famous R&D 1 team. This used a dot matrix style of display. These displays, I did a little digging about these today. They were super popular in the 90s in America, apparently in no small part due to these pinball machines called Checkpoint pinball machines. First dot matrix display in a pinball machine, for what it's worth. For all you pinball enthusiasts out there, you'll be pleased to hear that. But that dot matrix display is part of what gave it its unique appearance, what with the tint, the green contrast, the green and black color scheme, etc. It's charmingly retro, I think is safe to say. It's not winning any awards by today's standards, but for the time, it was really, 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 really cool.
Yeah, that the green, it's weird. I have almost a nostalgia for it, even though I never owned that original Game Boy. I recently played Metroid 2 on the NSO service, and I chose to play most of it with the OG green, color filter, just because it felt, I'm playing this classic game. It fits right in. And then I switched to the color later on in the game, but I played for a while with that filter because at this point, looking back on it again with the benefit of being able to make that choice, I guess, it's classic.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in playing the games the way that they're intended to be played, right? The way the developer made them. So you can. There's a lot of emulators out there too, and the default is often to do a very a white and black contrast, right, instead of the green. Mm-hmm. And it's just not the same to me. It doesn't look quite as nice. That said, if you pick up an old DMG today, there's generally a bit of screen degradation as well. So things get even blurrier than they used to be when we were kids. So Rick, I think earlier you were mentioning at the game shop there was a bivert backlit display. So that's truly the way to go back and play. But I do think that with the NSO service, they've done a good job of having those overlays. Or there's some sort of shaders, I guess, for capturing the essence of what the game was meant to look like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, most of these original Game Boys are older than 30 years. They're 30 years plus old. So screen degradation is just going to happen. That's one of the tough things about being into retro collecting and retro gaming. It's time. It's so hard to stop and fight against time. Sometimes it's futile. And that's why these emulators are, in a lot of ways, the best ways to play. Depending on what you're looking for. If you want an authentic experience, well, maybe not. But all I'm saying is when I picked up that screen, the one that I just got 2 weeks ago, shell looks amazing. Like everything about it looks great. The buttons feel factory fresh. The screen just doesn't look as good as I remember, and it does look quite blurry. I don't know. I don't have the technical know-how to take it apart and like judge for myself if it's just, misremembering what things look like or if it's actual degradation. But you should know if you're in the market for these that is something you should both look out for and be prepared for. You can't get away from it.
Yeah, it's been amazing over the last few years too, just to watch the boom of the modding community and market as well around these Game Boys, because a lot of folks are nostalgic for Game Boy games, or whether they want to recapture a little bit of that nostalgia, or whether they just have a collection or they have their old games, they want to play them again. And then they find themselves in the situation you're in, Rick, where they're playing and they're like, oh, the screen just isn't the way I remember it. But there's a lot of folks out there doing, you can send in mod repairs. There's a lot of different companies that have kits where you can do mod kits by yourself. Make sure to do plenty of YouTube research before you try your own mod. I've learned the hard way that I'm not very good at soldering, but it can be done, and it's cool. And it's cool to see that scene has really blown up over the last few years, because there's a lot of folks that just do love the Game Boy Color in particular. 90s are really big right now, when big come back with the 90s. And so it's been cool to watch that the Game Boy never left, and it's I don't know if I want to say it's bigger than ever, because it was fucking huge before, but it's still there.
I'm looking at it on my shelf right now. It's still pretty fucking big. This is just a little aside, but speaking of like retro things coming back into favor, there's like circles now where writing letters like by hand is very popular.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, that checks out. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I thought it was neat, so I thought I'd bring it up.
That's super cool. I mean, think about it. If you were to go to the mail, like most of the time, you pull out your bills, whatever. The best thing when I go to the mail is when I get like a new Game Boy game or something. Mm-hmm. But aside from that, like there's something about that handwritten analog anything, man. Like there's something about it.
For sure. We've got some stats for all you nerds out there. This was, as we said, a 4th gen console. The CPU that they used on this guy was the Sharp LR35902, core at 4.19 megahertz. The screen was an STN LCD display using the dot matrix style. It was 160 by 144 pixels, 60 hertz, which I did not know. Total dimensions of 5.8 inches, 3.5 inches, and 1.3 inches length, width, height. Of the whole Game Boy, not the screen, by the way. And the whole thing, the Game Boy, weighed roughly 7.8 ounces. It's a hefty little guy. Buttons, it's got your standard Nintendo buttons. It's got your D-pad, which Nintendo did actually have a patent for. They did the original D-pad. Pretty cool. Start, select A and B. That's all. But it did have a volume slider and a contrast slider with that old one. That's pretty cool. That's something that's pretty neat to see. It's a relic for sure, but it's neat to see. But we don't want to talk about stats for nerds, because we're cool. We're cool dudes, right?
Dudes.
Yeah, there it is.
Been waiting for my opportunity. I missed a couple earlier, and I was like, oh, fuck, I don't want to let Rick down. I got to do it.
I was going to say, I peppered in the word dude quite a bit.
I know.
Let's talk about games. That's why we're all here. Let's talk about some of the games. Gentlemen, what were some of your favorite games to play on the original Game Boy?
We've all talked about Pokemon already, right? So, Pokemon was the thing. If you want to talk about Game Boy games, other than Tetris, I guess, because it was bundled in, Pokemon. You got to start there, I feel like.
Yeah. Here, Alex, do you want to get into the Pokemon talk?
Yeah, sure, man. You can't talk about the Game Boy and not bring up Pokemon.
Yeah. Pokemon and family members. That is what drew a lot of people in. My cousins, I have multiple cousins, but me and two of my cousins, Tim and Jeremy, we all got Game Boys. I actually had a Game Boy Pocket first. I never had the big fat boy until recently. But the Game Boy Pocket was basically just the fat boy redesigned.
A little slimmer, fits right in that pocket.
It does. Hey, it's in the name. It was invented by John Pocket. And we all got Game Boys. We all got Pokemon Red or Blue. I had Red. And since there were 3 of us,
Yeah, Team Red.
we all alternated. We got every starter. We got every legendary bird, every, at the time, evolution. It's convenient having 2 other cousins to play with, 2 other family members. It was a great time, you know. I do remember, though, now that we're talking about those cousins, I have a very specific memory. They're older than I am, so they often took advantage of me because I was a dumb kid. And I remember I had gotten my Blastoise, because Squirtle is always my favorite starter, still is. And I'd gotten my Blastoise, and I was so proud. He was so strong and cool, and he had all attack moves because stat moves are for nerds. And my cousin was like, "Hey man, like I caught this Pokemon. I don't know. I think you might like it." And I was like, "Oh gee, Tim, what is it?" And he said, "It's called a Ditto. And did you know that it can turn into any Pokemon?" And I was like, "Oh my God, Tim, that's so cool. Can you trade me it?" And he was like, "I'll trade it for you for your Blastoise. Because, I mean, remember, this thing can turn into a Blastoise." And I was like, yeah, thank you. Okay, I'm going to stop that. I was like, "Thank you, Tim." And long story short, I got home. I cried and cried and cried. And my mom took me back to my cousin's and got him in trouble and made him trade back with me.
Nice.
He still pushed you into puberty, though.
Yeah. Me and my brother both got Pokemon for that Christmas. I got Red, he got Blue, and I have a couple of like really distinct memories. Number one is we would stay up late at night, way past our bedtimes, playing Pokemon, and what we'd do is we'd put towels under the door so that my parents couldn't see the light coming from under the door, because again, no backlight, so you had to have the light on to play it. So we would stay up all night long playing Pokemon. This is like, I was in like 5th grade or something like that, like staying up way too late. And then the other one is using the missing no glitch to totally fuck up our cartridges. They don't work anymore. So I think that's the reason why. It could be all the game sharking too, but I don't think we game sharked this one. We started game sharking gold and silver.
Ooh, you guys were living on the edge.
Yeah.
See, I never did the missing no glitch, but I do remember when, you know, and this is another thing, I talk about this all the time on this show, but man, do I miss when the internet wasn't ubiquitous and like being a part of the school culture on the playground, like was how you got news. Don't get me wrong, it's better the way it is today, but I still miss it. When we found out on the playground that, you know, if you disconnected the link cable while you were trading, it could clone Pokemon, but it could also brick your cartridge. That's what got a lot of us. I didn't get a bricked cartridge. I did get a corrupted save file, but that's about it. I also got a couple of cloned like Zapdoses though. So, you know, you win some, you lose some.
Yeah. Did you guys complete the Pokédex on Red and Blue?
Oh God, no.
Oh, I did years and years ago. And so my buddy Andrew that had the blue cart, his mom is the one who bought us the Game Boy and those 2 games. We did some trading, but I also had I must have borrowed at some point. I must have borrowed his game or something, because I definitely didn't own 2 versions, but I was trading between myself at home just to get different Pokemon.
Yeah,
mostly the starters. But I did at one point in my life have the full Pokédex.
Yeah, I did too for Red and Blue, and then in Gold and Silver also. And that's the last
Nice.
Pokédex I completed, because after that point, no fucking way.
I have never completed a single Pokedex.
There's still time, Rick.
Never did it. Yeah. I mean, you're not wrong. And yeah, that's how you knew that you were living the luxury life, is if you had 2 Game Boys in the household and 2 game carts, so you could just trade with yourself. You know, have a full team of all the starters, have all the evolutions, have all the version exclusives, etc. I didn't have that luxury until I ended up getting a Game Boy Advance later. Actually, no, Game Boy Color, but that was later on down the line.
A couple other games, I guess, that like kind of define my time with the original Game Boy before we get into the color. Super Mario Land 2, 6 Golden Coins, and Link's Awakening. Those 2 games, along with Pokemon, are like the trifecta, the Triforce, if you will.
Hey, I got that reference.
I tend to agree. Those are top tier games. Outside of those, I would say Kirby's Dream Land 1 and 2.
Yes.
Pretty important in my Game Boy history. And then there's also, I played a lot of Kirby's Pinball Land as well. So a lot of Kirby time, which is another super approachable game. I think, some people rag on it for being too easy, but I like it for that. And Wario Land was another one that was great for the original Game Boy.
Yes, sir. Super Mario Land 1, 2, and 3. 3 being the first Wario Land. Those are all games that I played the heck out of. And I'm probably going to use some of the music from Super Mario Land 1 because it's really good. But those games were terrific. Mortal Kombat 2 for the Game Boy, which is objectively not the best version of the game, but I played that like crazy as a kid. That's actually what started getting me into fighting games. I was really into fighting games as a kid. Like that was my favorite thing until I discovered Final Fantasy IX.
It's a tough one to learn on, man.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the computer, the AI in those days, I mean, it wasn't crazy good or anything. You could cheese it. I mean, the classic moves were to just alternate uppercut and jump forward kick. Just
right on.
Spam that and you're golden. You could beat any computer.
I'm a big fan of the sweep kick myself.
Some other games that we didn't touch on but were super popular. Dr. Mario, that came out for the Game Boy. Donkey Kong Land, that was on the Game Boy as well. What else do we got here? We've got some Yoshi, we've got some F1 racing, various more Kirby's and Wario's and etc.
We've got Donkey Kong 94 that you're always shouting out coming out for the original Game Boy.
Yes, thank you. Donkey Kong 94. Very good game. Super good game.
The Donkey Kong series, I think there's 3, right, for the Game Boy? 1, 2, and 3, Donkey Kong Land 1, 2, and 3.
Anyways. Yes, I believe so.
Yeah. For what that system could do, they're good platformers. It's pretty amazing.
Oh yeah. 100%. Those are some awesome games. There were also some, non like Nintendo exclusives like F1 Racing. You've got some Madden stuff. You've got some sports titles that, I mean, it was the best they could do at the time. So it's really tough to judge them too harshly at this point. But yeah, so many good memories with the Game Boy Pocket, the Game Boy Light, if you were Dave's cool friend. Lots of good stuff here. But it did not stop there. Of course not. They came out shortly thereafter with an upgraded Game Boy called the Game Boy Color. Now, I don't know about you guys, but this is when I started like being a super Game Boy fan. I mean, I had the Pocket, but, most kids did. So it was like, or at least, at my school, it seemed like most kids did anyway. So, it wasn't like too crazy. But then when the Game Boy Color came out, specifically with that atomic purple coloring that they took from the N64, I got that for Easter. I don't know if giving gifts on Easter is a thing. I don't know why my family did that, but
I talked to the Easter Bunny, bro. Like, he just gave me candy.
What's that?
So I got to talk to the Easter Bunny, bro. He just gave me candy.
But that's when getting that Game Boy was when I started like being, oh man, I really love playing this Game Boy thing.
The Game Boy, the original Game Boy, I'm thinking back and I'm like, I can really only remember playing Pokemon, Mario, and Zelda. That's it. Game Boy Color, though, there's like 20 of these games where I'm like, oh yeah, I played the shit out of all of these. Like that's really when it blew up,
Oh yeah. And especially the Game Boy Color came out roughly the same time, and I'm just spitballing here. I don't have the dates for these Pokemon games, but it came out roughly the same time as the second gen of Pokemon games, Gold, Silver, and Crystal. Well, Gold and Silver anyway. And that was a big deal. Seeing not only getting a sequel to one of the biggest cultural phenomenons that we've ever experienced as people of a certain age, but getting a sequel to that in color on a new Game Boy was, it's really, really hard to overstate how insane this was back in the day. It really, really is. This released in October and November of 1998 for Japan and North America / Europe, respectively. Again, also in production until 2003. A little easier to believe on that one.
Yeah.
The initial price was $80, which is roughly $148 today. Not bad at all.
So the original Game Boy was $90, and then what is this? 9 years later, there's a new version that has color, like uses less batteries, all this stuff, and it's cheaper than the first one. It was wild.
It is wild.
Yes, and just speculating, but I would assume after the, internally the Game Boy didn't have a crazy success, but like critically, it had mostly positive, reviews. And I think especially the Pokemon boom, when they said, hey, like we could not only sell this system, but like we're making all the money back on all these games. That's probably, I mean, that's what Valve did with the Steam Deck, right? I mean,
yeah.
That was probably their business minds thinking like, yeah, we could sell it for even cheaper than the rest of the competition, and we're going to make bank on all of these games because you've got to not develop, but you've got to go through us to get this onto the system. So, I mean, I'm not a business guy, but I mean, they knew what they were doing.
Yeah, I don't think the color came with a dedicated pack in either, which makes that justifies the $10 price difference a little bit, but not enough.
Yeah, I don't think it did. Mine definitely didn't, but I also wasn't one of the very first adopters or anything.
Yeah, it's jumping ahead not too far, but it's they're connected. But going from the Game Boy to the Pocket to the Color to the Advance, it's really interesting and pretty smart how Nintendo has the backward compatibility all the way through, right? So you had gangbuster sales on the Game Boy. I'm not sure how well the Pocket did, like comparably, probably not quite as well as the original toaster version. But then going into the Color, obviously you had that upgraded Color, but it's a bit of a push to try and get parents to buy this. We already have a Game Boy type of deal. But this one does color, that kind of thing, sure. But that's maybe not quite sold them on getting this brand new system yet because, what about your other Game Boy? So the fact that you can play your original Game Boy carts on the Color, I think, was a big reason, like really smart of Nintendo to do. And then in turn to do again for the Advance, that you can have that backward compatibility of the Color and the OG. Yeah,
that was huge. One of the biggest losses, IMO, is the loss of the what do you call it? The physical cartridge slot on the DS models. I know we're not talking about the DS models today, but I look at my 3DS and I'm just like, I wish I could just plug a card in and play. I don't want to play on the big chunky boy if I don't have to.
Nintendo is dirty too. They said with the DS that they weren't gonna kill the Game Boy, but they did.
That backwards compatibility was huge, and this was at least the first handheld system to do it. I mean, most of the other systems didn't really have a chance, to be fair, but it's still important to note. They could still make money off of all of the games that they made for their previous system, quote unquote. Some people don't consider the Game Boy Color like a reasonable upgrade. They just think of it as a kind of a generation 0.5.
Yeah, because it's like there. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember in my memory you can't play Game Boy Color games on the original Game Boy. Is that right? But it was the other way around, and you got like these new color palettes and stuff. So I remember like plugging in Pokemon Red, and it had like this, instead of being black and white, it was red and white, basically. But so it wasn't like a full color upgrade in that way, but it was cool. And the ability to plug in your old stuff and play was awesome. But like, as far as like power and like, the tech and stuff, I don't remember it being that different. And I don't assume it would be that different.
Yeah, your memory serves you well, Dave. The exception being, so Game Boy Color carts are generally, they're clear, right? But then they also have black, like there's you'll find Game Boy Color carts that are black, and those ones do work on the original Game Boy. Okay. So it's kind of a middle ground, but the majority of Game Boy Color games are produced with that clear cart, and those ones do not play on the original DMG.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yep, well said. Some of the black carts are like Tetris DX. That was the one black cart that I had that I loved more than anything else. That and Bomberman Pocket, maybe? It was Bomberman something.
Bomberman
and of
GB.
course, Link's Awakening.
Yeah. Well, Link's Awakening got its own version, like the upgrade Link's Awakening DX, that wasn't just like that, color filter. It was actually made in like full color with like different colors and stuff on the screen at the same time, and it had that extra dungeon and stuff. So like I played Link's Awakening on the original Game Boy and I loved it so much I wanted the color version of it on the Game Boy Color as well.
And it's pretty too.
Yeah, still to this day, it's my preferred version of Link's Awakening.
That's what we love to hear it, man. Love to hear it. We keep talking about the color, and I don't know if you noticed, but it's in the name, so it's pretty important. So obviously the games made for the Game Boy Color were designed with color in mind. And it's interesting too, because developers were the ones that were approaching Nintendo in like 95, 96, and they were like, hey, like, this is not sophisticated. It needs better hardware. Like you got to give us something to work with, which is interesting because I can't imagine developers doing that to Nintendo today and Nintendo doing anything but ignoring them. But those color swaps, if you tried to play a game from the original Game Boy on the Game Boy Color, you might, in some cases, get specific color palettes for that game. I think like Super Mario Land 2 and 3, I'm pretty sure they had them, Kirby's Dream Land. But if it wasn't a game that had specific color palettes, there were a host of generic ones. And as the screen is booting up and you're getting the Nintendo logo, if you pressed a button, I don't remember if it's A or B, and then up and down on the D-pad, it actually might be both A or B. But if you pressed one and then pressed up and down on the D-pad, you could cycle between different color palettes. And I don't know about you guys, but like as a kid, this was peak technology. I never got tired of this. You want to play Mortal Kombat with an obnoxious pink filter, like pink and red? Go for it. You want to play original Pokemon where like Bulbasaur for some reason is purple? You could do it. It was so cool. I loved it so much.
Yeah, I don't remember like messing with that stuff. It's possible that because again, I was, when this came out, I was 10 years old. I just didn't know that you could change the colors. There was a default one, depending on what game you put in. So I remember like I said, putting in Pokemon Red and being like, oh, everything's red instead of gray now. That's cool.
Yeah. Yeah. It was, admittedly, a colored screen was something that they arrived late to the party to. But even still, they had so much success before. They're having so much success with Pokemon that I think most critics and consumers didn't like hold that against them. Like today, when the Switch finally gets the upgrade to Bluetooth, you could use Bluetooth. I remember when that happened, people were like, "We could do this for years on Sony. Like, what the hell?" But back then, it wasn't as big of a deal because this was a new frontier. And critics, critics echoed everything that we're saying. It was received quite positively, largely due to the improved clarity of the screen, the color display, and the backwards compatibility. And I don't think we mentioned, I think maybe Alex mentioned it in passing, but only 2 batteries this time. But roughly 10 hours of battery life, but you're using half the batteries. So that is an overall win. We call that a net win in podcasting. That's what we call that.
The Game Boy Color was wild too. The marketing behind the color was wild. There was so many commercials. Like I didn't have cable growing up, so I didn't get bombarded like a lot of kids did. But you couldn't go anywhere without seeing a commercial for Toys R Us or a Game Boy Color. And at the same time, on top of all that, this deluge of marketing, you also had a bunch of third parties making there's peripherals for the DMG, but they really slammed it in hard with the Game Boy Color. Like we're talking like necklace chains that you can put your color in. I still kind of want one today, to be honest. But wear around your neck, that kind of deal. Like the worm light really came into its own. That's the deal you plug into the side of the deal, and instead of catching the street lamps or toweling the door. Which before I forget, that's like maybe the second coolest reason I've heard for toweling the door.
Whatever is the first.
Yeah, it might be the first.
Playing your Game Boy Color.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But yeah, all these peripherals, man, it was nuts. Like there's anything you can think of to throw on that thing to try and make it better. There's a third party making it.
Oh yeah, and listeners, don't worry. We've got a section for peripherals and accessories at the bottom. We're going to get into it. Just talking about the stats on this guy, it's largely the same CPU. They increased the RAM a little bit. The display is basically the same, but LCD color. They ditched the dot matrix look and style. Otherwise, that's why a lot of people don't consider this a hard second generation. They consider it a soft upgrade. I don't know that I agree. I also don't know that that's a productive conversation to have, quite frankly. But some people feel that way. That's fine. I still look at it as a meaningful upgrade, but and the colors, Mason, the colors. We got to talk about those. Tons of colors on these. What's your favorites? Let's just rapid fire some favorite colors of Game Boys.
I mean, the atomic purple for me, man, that was my jam as well.
Yeah, the atomic purple, that's the classic. We also had the solid purple Game Boy Color because, again, my brother and I both had to have one. And little thing about my brother, he's for sure not listening to this, but he broke several Game Boys by throwing them when he would get mad playing Pokemon. So we cycled through some colors.
I would get angry and throw my Game Boys occasionally too, but I would throw them into the cushions of the couch or the chair to make sure that they didn't break.
I'm embarrassed and ashamed to admit that I have broken a Game Boy Pocket. Not a color, never broke my color. Mm-hmm. Did break my Game Boy Pocket because Wario Land frustrated me as a child, and I wasn't taught to deal with emotions healthy back then. Anyway.
Both you and my brother grew up to be productive members of society, so I think it's okay. Everyone gets a couple.
Yeah, hey, that's the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me.
When I was really in the thralls of Game Boy collecting in my adult life, I had I think they called it the kiwi green color. So that was another solid choice. I've since sold it off, but that was a nice color too.
I'm not as big of a fan of the kiwi green as I was the more foresty green that was on the Pocket and the original Game Boy. But the kiwi green, I mean, it says something. I mean, it's very vibrant. All of the colors for the Game Boy Pocket, with the exception of the translucent ones like atomic purple, were they were vibrant. They weren't pastel. They were made to pop because it was. I mean, people seeing you with a bright green Game Boy is a form of marketing in itself, right? I mean, people see it and they say, "Whoa, that's not the Game Boy I grew up with. I should look into that. I should flip open my Sears catalog and bookmark page 19 where the Game Boy Color is being advertised. And then I'll call in later, maybe put it on layaway at Kmart. Am I using enough 90s references? Can I move on?
What's great is I'm tracking it all. I'm like, yeah, sure, makes sense.
Yeah. None of that felt out of place to say. Layaway, sure, yeah.
This is also the time when I think it's the first time I remember Nintendo doing special versions to go along with games or something like that. There was the Pokemon Yellow Game Boy Color that was fucking badass, and I wanted it so bad.
Yes, good call, Dave. There were several Pokemon special edition Game Boys. I feel like I just saw recently one of the Pikachu ones being sold sealed CIB for thousands of dollars.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's wild. This is also a time that it's pretty cool with the Game Boy Color. They started integrating. There's only a handful of games that it works with, but it's where you see Nintendo start to do some cross-system stuff. So you're able to use certain games with the Nintendo 64.
Yeah, that was again for me Pokemon. I wanted to put my Pokemon in Stadium and just wreck shop with my team. But also Mario Golf and Mario Tennis, I did that. And again, wreck shop with my RPG character that was a man among boys in those games.
Yes, sir. And the Pokemon Stadium games they're really tough if you're not uploading your Game Boy squad.
Oh yeah, that was the only thing that I never had a 64 growing up. My friend did. But that was the only thing that we ever used that for, was to upload our respective Pokemon teams into Pokemon Stadium to fight on the big screen. Like,
Yeah.
that's another thing too. Like all of you, if you're younger than us listening, and that's fine. Like this, we're not saying this in a derogatory way, but like it was a big deal back then to see Game Boy games on the screen. And it's not something that we think about today because like handheld emulators can have HDMI out, and the Switch NSO, like you could play Game Boy games on the screen now. I mean, there are workarounds to everything. You could see, I mean, people stream like emulated Game Boy games. But back then, seeing like playing Pokemon through the game pack on, the big TV, I know we're getting away from handhelds a little bit, but pretty insane.
Yeah.
It was super cool. And the Super Game Boy as well for Super Nintendo was super rad. Super. But that would let you play
over here.
Yeah, right. But that would let you play your Game Boy games on the big screen as well. And I think that added some pretty rad some borders or whatever, which are always kind of fun as a kid.
Yes, the borders. I loved the borders. That was my favorite part of putting them up there. I mean, it was really cool seeing, playing the games on the big screen. But, those borders, it was just, it was the fanciest thing, a kid
I love
could
that.
have.
My favorite border was the border that looked like a Game Boy. So I was like,
That's there's a Simpsons gag that's very similar to that. I can't think of it. Oh well, that's okay. Some of the most popular Game Boy Color games, of course, Gold, Silver, Crystal, the Pokemon trio for that generation. Pokemon Pinball was another one. Man, I loved Pokemon Pinball as a kid. It came with a little slot for a battery that a AAA battery that you put directly into the game pack, and it gave it Rumble. That was like the first Rumble game on handheld that I had ever experienced. I'm not confident enough to say that it was the first one, but maybe.
It's definitely the biggest one. There's a handful of games that have that Rumble feature in the cart, but the Pokemon Pinball is definitely the one that takes the cake.
There's also the Pokemon trading card game for Game Boy Color, where this is Pokemon spin-off time, where they're like, they're buying every single main game we're putting out. We're going to start making tons of other stuff, and they're going to buy that too. And they did.
Oh yeah, really underrated game, by the way. Love the Pokemon trading card game.
Yeah, it's good. I did it on my my podcast with friend of pixelprojectradio, Bill Barber. So it's it's pretty fun. The Pokemon trading card game, as it was in 1998, still pretty fun.
Oh, absolutely. It's one of the few Game Boy games that I have CIB. It's the box is a little scuffed up, but it's over there.
Nice.
Also, The Legend of Zelda: Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages. Those were very popular, selling just under 4 million copies. Those are some pretty underrated Zelda games, if you ask me.
Yeah, I'm real interested in revisiting those. I played them back on the Game Boy Color and haven't played them since. So like the next time I want kind of that old school Zelda, those are the two I'm going to try. I remember liking Seasons more than Ages because changing the seasons to like solve puzzles was easier than traveling through time for me. But both of them were pretty fun. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually haven't played those ones. Those are one of my gaming sins, but I do have both of them. I have cards for both, and I look forward to playing them as well. And I'm also looking forward to the Greater Zeitgeist being able to play them because I believe it was announced they are coming to NSO.
Yeah.
It's good stuff. It's a good time to be a Game Boy fan.
Mm-hmm.
It is. They're nailing it with their. I'm a collector, so I have a big Game Boy library, but I mean, everything they're rolling out for the NSO so far, I'm like, yes, give it to the people. I love it. I love to see it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was pleasantly surprised seeing all of the Game Boy titles that they were pushing out. I don't have that tier of NSO, but I mean, they're doing a good job of putting stuff that the people want to play out on it.
Yeah, it's a shame they make you pay extra for the Game Boy Advance, but on the like basic tier that I have, I can still play the Game Boy and Game Boy Color stuff, and I've had a good time looking through those. A couple other games I want to shout out if we're talking about games now. I said them before, but Mario Tennis and Mario Golf for the Game Boy Color are so good. golf video games in general are just so much fun. Like across the board, it's really hard to make a bad golf video game in my experience. But these are RPGs. So like you start out as like the new kid or like, you know, the new scrub in the clubhouse or whatever. And you work your way up to being like, you know, you like bring on Tiger Woods. Like Tiger's got nothing on my character from Mario Golf in 1999. So those are great. And then, like I said, you could import them into the N64 versions and just crush with them.
I agree. Those are a couple of my favorite Game Boy Color games as well, Dave. They're top tier.
Yeah, if Colby Moyer from Switch It Up is listening, let's just say your athletic hero Tiger Woods doesn't have anything on
Dave Jackson from Mario Golf or whatever I named him.
Oh, I was gonna name him Butt Munch, but yeah,
that's probably
Dave
what
Jackson's
I named him
probably
for sure. Yeah, ass face.
But we would be remiss to not mention the final style of Game Boy that we're talking about today, which is the Game Boy Advance. Hugely, hugely popular. I think literally everybody I knew in elementary school had one. Everybody that I knew, I'm sure people didn't, but it seemed like everybody had one. And let's my voice is going higher, so let's talk about it.
I'm going to derail you real quick, just to tie up the Game Boy Color. And there's folks developing for Game Boy Color today, and I've recently been playing some really cool games. One in particular being called The Machine. So I believe the publisher is Incubate Games, but there's a handful of different games. Daedalus is another one. Pine Creek, Genesis. I mean, they're like came out within the past 3 years. And I just think it's super cool that this old technology is getting new games, and they're fun, dude. They're like really cool.
Yeah, it's super cool. People are making Game Boy games. They're making new NES games. Some of these retro developers are, you know, it's really cool how they're, instead of saying like we're gonna make something that looks like an NES game and put it out on Steam and Switch and whatever, they're like, oh, we're gonna make a real NES game. That's super cool.
Right. And you can get the ROM and play it on an emulator, but a lot of them are offering like a physical cart too, which is pretty rad. Mm-hmm. But I love that the Game Boy still has life.
Yeah.
Hey, it's never been a better time to be a Game Boy fan, and that goes for that too.
Yeah. The Game Boy Advance though, like I said this about the Game Boy Color, which is like I said, that's when it exploded. The Game Boy Advance though, like now I'm like entering high school, and like eventually during the Game Boy Advance's life cycle, I got a job and I could buy video games with my own money. And I bought video games with my own money. And so this is where like it really exploded. I'm looking at this like big list of Game Boy Advance games. I'm like, yep, those 10, this entire column, all my shit. So the Game Boy Advance is like, when I look back at the systems that I like hold near and dear to my heart and nothing will ever change my mind, Game Boy Advance is right up there.
Would you say that you were playing with power?
I would say that. And I did say that.
You can't stop this guy from saying it. Everybody that he meets, I'm playing with power. And they're like, Dave, this is a Wendy's.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, the Game Boy Advance was fantastic. It is fantastic. I think I got mine probably the summer of going into my maybe junior year of high school before a road trip, and played the library for that system it's ginormous, but there are a ton of gems on there. And I think, you know, earlier, Ricky, you were talking about how maybe that Game Boy Color wasn't quite the technological advancement that people wanted. I think the Advance really brought that. It was lacking the backlit screen until we got the SP version. But nonetheless, like having the shoulder buttons, just, more in-depth games, it was a really cool system. And I'm, to this day, a big fan of the wide boy Game Boy Advance versus the SP, which is somewhat controversial to folks. But I think ergonomically, I think it's a fantastic system.
Yep.
Absolutely. It was released in early to mid 2001, and it was in production until 2008. Now, interestingly, the Advance released relatively late in the cycle because the DS released in 2004. So that's not really a lot of time for it to be on the throne. But on the throne it was. It was a $100 price point at first, which in today's dollars is just under 171. Not so bad. The CPU finally changed. It got an upgraded CPU, 16.8 megahertz. It's an ARM7 TDMI. If you're wondering, by the way, I don't know what any of this means. I just took the good notes. And I think I have this right. If I have this wrong, listeners, please correct me. A dual CPU, a Sharp LR CPU, the same exact ones for the Game Boy, for that backwards compatibility. They kept that all through until the Nintendo DS took it away after, I think, the DS Lite. Approximately 15 hours of battery on this bad boy, and that's awesome. Still only 2 batteries. The screen got an upgrade as well. 240 by 160 pixels, a 3.2 aspect ratio now, as opposed to, Alex, you probably know this better than me. Is it a 10.9, 10 by 9 aspect ratio on the original and color?
Might be 1:1, but I'm not sure. You're probably right.
Or maybe 4:3. I'm not 100% off the top of the dome.
Are you talking about the Advance or the original?
No, the color and the original.
Oh, yeah. I thought it was 1:1.
Maybe. I very well could be wrong. But the Advance was 3 by 2. So that's cool. And that was the first horizontal, well, not the first. Game & Watches were horizontal, right?
Yes.
Yeah, but this, of the Game Boy line, this was the first horizontal form factor. And we would see that staying. You could argue that the DS is horizontal. You could argue that it's vertical too. I would probably say horizontal just because of the button placement. Switch, obviously. Wii U gamepad, obviously. And I don't foresee them going back to vertical. I think most folks much prefer the horizontal, which is fine. Is fine.
You never know with Nintendo, though.
We got to talk about games. You both had mentioned how humongous this library was. In my memory, specifically with just licensed games out the wazoo. So many licensed games. Star Wars: Revenge of the Sith, or wait, is that the third one? Episode 3.
Yep.
That one was a huge time sink for me as a kid. It wasn't a great game, but I played the heck out of it. Tony Hawk, that came onto the DS, or the Game Boy Advance. SpongeBob, that's where you got your SpongeBobs, Jimmy Neutrons. There was just so much licensed games.
Man, so first of all, Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2 in particular was on Game Boy Advance, and that it was in 3D. It was the game in 3D on the Game Boy Advance, which was wild at the time. That it blew my mind that my Game Boy could play this. It was the same game, basically, could play the same thing that my N64 could, Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2. But licensed games, the Lord of the Rings games for Game Boy Advance were fantastic. And I got to shout those out. They're like little ARPG, like Diablo type games. And again, very distinct memory of playing the, I think it was the Return of the King game while on a road trip and listening to the Good Charlotte, the Young and the Restless, or Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, whatever that album's called, on my CD player on repeat for like a 13-hour road trip, just playing through this Lord of the Rings game over and over and over again because I was having so much fun with it. And the Good Charlotte. Nice. I was having fun with that too.
What would you reasonably give to go back and experience that all over again?
Ah, man. One of you, probably.
Oh, damn. Don't reveal which one on air.
Yeah.
Listeners, if you want to take a guess, you could at TFTBL on Twitter. Tales from the Backlog. Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. Good. That was good times though. And like, I'll always have love for those Lord of the Rings games.
Yeah, dude, those I haven't played the ones for the Game Boy, but Lord of the Rings games in general, like I have a bunch of them, or there's a handful for PS2. So the beauty of these Lord of the Ring games, that's not even it kind of sucks, I guess, is there's a licensing issue. So you can't like play any of these things unless you have that original hardware. So if you wanted to get a hold of that Lord of the Rings Game Boy game, that's something that you have to have on the physical card or get a hold of it nefariously on the internet. But
We wouldn't know anything about that.
no.
Not us. No, sir.
Every game that I put on my Retroid Pocket, I buy first and I dump the ROM. I do it legally. And none of you here can prove me wrong.
Yeah.
Anyways, some of the most popular Game Boy Advance games, let's talk a little bit about those. Obviously, Pokemon is dominating the list, and from what I'm looking at here, Pokemon dominates the top 3 spots in the top 10 with Ruby and Sapphire, Fire Red and Leaf Green, which are my personal favorite Pokemon games, and at number 3, Pokemon Emerald.
And they had another Pokemon pinball game. If I'm not mistaken, they did another. This is when like the Mystery Dungeon series started. Might have been DS, but yeah, they started to spin out. They did another Pokemon trading card game only in Japan. Kind of sucks. We never got that, but I think that was Game Boy Advance as well. And yeah, Pokemon. I mean, when I talk about like how there's dozens of these games, where I'm like, yeah, I love those. Make no mistake, Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald still dominated my time with the Game Boy Advance. And Fire Red and Leaf Green, of course.
Yeah, I recently put in about 30 hours into Leaf Green, and it was great to revisit that game.
It's my first experience buying a game on eBay, and my first experience getting a fake game on eBay was Leaf Green.
Oh no!
Oh no!
Yeah,
See, mine was opposite,
back
man.
then too. Back in high school, not recently.
I'm more recent, like probably within the last 3 years, I picked up a Game Boy Advance that I was looking to resell or something, and the seller accidentally left Leaf Green in there. Or whether it was accidentally or they're just like, oh, here's a bonus. So I lucked out, man.
Hell yeah.
So sorry for your story.
Good stuff. There are a lot of bona fide classics. I'm just looking at this list. You've got Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. You've got the Final Fantasy VI Advance port, which is a damn good port. You've got Metroid Fusion. You've got Golden Sun, Donkey Kong Country, Zelda Minish Cap, Wario Land 4. There are a lot of really well-loved games on this system. And that's not even, Kingdom Hearts. Paging Eric Guess. He's sitting up in his bed right now and he's like,
yeah, he woke up in a cold sweat.
He's like, Nomura? Right now?
You had the Castlevania games on Game Boy Advance is my introduction to the Castlevania series with Circle of the Moon. Fire Emblem made its debut on the Game Boy Advance.
Let's see, Mario Kart Super Circuit was the introduction of Mario Kart to handheld gaming too. It was the first handheld Mario Kart.
Yeah, and they started remaking some of the old Mario games. So like Mario Brothers 2, I think got a remake on the Game Boy Advance. That's how I first played that game.
Yep.
And yeah, I mean, like just looking down the list, Game Boy Advance was the first time I played Final Fantasy VI. So like that was an extremely special experience for me the first time I played that. And Rick, you mentioned Wario Land 4, which is just a wild game, but still one of my favorites for the system.
Absolutely a wild game. I have played so little of it. Actually, really the only Wario Land game I've played is the first one, which is still really good, but you know, I've heard they get so much better with each entry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Wario Land 4 is great. Wario Land 3 for the Game Boy Color we didn't get a chance to talk about, but that was my first Wario Land game. I love that one. Looking at the list here, I didn't play this, but like, God bless the Game Boy Advance for giving us WarioWare on there too, which would be a great game to play.
Call.
Yeah, those Super Mario Advance is, I think, what they titled those remakes of the Mario games. So starting with Super Mario 2 it gets a little confusing. So yeah. Super Mario 2 and Super Mario was Super Mario Advance, and then Super Mario World was Super Mario Advance 2, and then I think maybe it's Yoshi's, I don't remember exactly what it is, but Wario ends up being one of those as well. But those reskins, remakes deals they're really good.
Yeah. Also, the first time I played A Link to the Past was on the Game Boy Advance. They put that on there with the Four Swords adventure, which I never played because I didn't have 3 friends that had the game. I had 3 friends. They didn't have the game though. But first time playing a lot of these like classic Super Nintendo games, because I never owned a Super Nintendo, was on the Game Boy Advance.
Same.
Yeah, I actually, now that you mention it, I think I'm in the same boat.
Hell yeah. Dudes.
In case you're wondering, listeners, there are, according to a quick Google search that I'm choosing to believe with no further questions, there are a total of 1,538 games for the Game Boy Advance. I believe that's, what does this say here? Localized English titles, or when Japan exclusive, they're Romaji transliterations. So I think that's exhaustive for the catalog, maybe. But no matter what, I mean, that's a lot of games.
Right. They did movies too, which is wild.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. I remember those. You could get like episodes of like SpongeBob on your Game Boy.
And Shrek. You can watch all of Shrek on your Game Boy.
Oh, I mean, I just assumed that was common knowledge. Come on, you think you're dealing with an amateur here? This is me we're talking about.
I love it.
Shrek. And I miss when Shrek was like a beloved, popular meme that everybody was into. So before we get to the plugs for my 2 wonderful guests and their equally wonderful shows and the listener responses, we've got some accessories to talk about. The Game Boy, the original, the color, the advance, so many accessories. And let's take a walk down memory lane and think about the ones that we had. So everybody had a link cable, pretty much, right? I think that's safe to say.
Yeah, for Pokemon. I remember in school we got Pokemon and Game Boys banned because we would have link cables connected between desks during class because people were trading and battling and stuff. Yeah, it's a real, like the bus aisle too, which is obviously you can't have that. So it was real degenerate shit at our school.
Bunch of sickos.
Yeah.
That's awesome. The link cable gave way to the wireless adapter for the Game Boy Advance, which to me as a child, before cell phones came out, or before smartphones came out, mind-blowing. I was like, whoa, this is sick. But then you couldn't do those slick link cable disconnect hacks. But hey, All right, I just wrote down a bunch of random ones that I found. So the first one that I found, Game Boy Pocket Sonar. Any of you know what this is?
Not me, no.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen one of these. I know virtually nothing about it. I think we could just skip to the next one because I know that we all know about this next one, the Game Boy Camera.
Oh, yeah.
And its counterpart, the Game Boy Printer.
Oh, check it out, boys.
Oh, shit. Alex has one.
Yes, you listeners don't get this wonderful feast for the eyes, but Alex has what looks to be a nice condition Game Boy Camera.
Yes, and printer. And I would love to hook this thing up and press play to print something, but the sound it makes is terrible. And I do not want to subject your listeners to that.
You get one of those Foley mics and put it up there and do some Game Boy Printer ASMR.
Oh,
I can imagine nothing worse.
It's fun though. And so the paper I have in it right now, the Game Boy Printer used special paper, right? And I don't know if you guys had one of these or not. I got one of these in my adult life, so I didn't have it as a kid. But the paper, the original paper that came with it was actually adhesive, so you could print whatever it was from your Game Boy camera or whatever game that maybe was compatible with the printer, and then you could just use it as a sticker, which is pretty rad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we used to. We had the Game Boy Color or camera and printer, and we used to take pictures of our dogs and stick the pictures everywhere around the house. And I don't have any of the stuff from when I was a kid. I have my Pokemon cartridges. The 0% chance they work, so I'm not even bothering like buying a Game Boy to test them. Other than that, we have nothing from our childhood gaming stuff. We had to sell all of it to get the next, new thing. The one thing I wish I had was those pictures we took with the Game Boy camera, because it's such a weird thing to sell. The Galaxy Brain idea to like, hey, let's make a camera and a printer and little kids can take pictures and print it and stick it places. But we loved it.
Yeah, I never had one myself. My cousin did. They didn't have the printer though, so we would basically just take pictures and look at them. But if you've never used one of these before, the Game Boy camera actually had included games. They were really rudimentary, but like there was a juggling game, sort of similar to the Game & Watch juggling games. There was like a racing game where like you were like a dude and you raced against another dude. But these were all designed so that you could take primitive selfies, like no joke, and that would be the character's face. So you could see yourself in the game. Now, naturally, being young, devious boys, what me and my cousin did so the Game Boy camera belonged to my cousin Jeremy, and me and Timmy, Jeremy's brother, we would take the Game Boy camera and we would stick it down our pants and take pictures of our unmentionables. What it actually looked like was just a black screen, because we were kids. We thought we were like breaking the rules so hard, so we would just like shove it down there, take a fucking picture. I never thought that I would be airing this out on the internet, just for what it's worth. But it would make the one cousin, it would make him like furiously angry. We got in a lot of trouble for doing that. Rightfully so, probably.
That's great. Yeah, no flash on the on the Game Boy camera.
Yeah.
For the best. There was a worm cam for the Game Boy Advance. It was basically just a souped up version of this thing. It could swivel, better camera, same idea. There was the Super Game Boy. I think one of you brought this up earlier. Super Game Boy lets you play your Game Boy games in, is it Super Nintendo, right?
Yep.
Pretty darn cool. One that I found today was called the Handy Boy. Fucking love that name.
Yep, it's great.
This thing is a freaking beast. It was marketed as an all-in-one kind of deal, and it gave you a huge screen magnifier with a light, fold-out speakers. Literally came with a lanyard to wear it around your neck, which I assume would like weigh as much as like Yami Yugi's little pyramid puzzle thing. That thing looks like it's like 20 pounds.
I was just thinking like how cool everyone must have thought people were if they were wearing one of these things around their neck, like going to school or, going to the club or something like that, right? That'll
Going to the club?
Yeah.
Some dude walks into like a fucking nightclub with one of these around his neck, and the bartender looks over, he's like, oh, he's gonna get so much fucking pussy.
Yeah, he's just crushing it. I mean, because you need the light. You're in the club, like you can't see the screen with the lights that are there, so you got to bring your own. I get it. One thing that's not on this list on the subject of lights is we mentioned before, but the worm light. Everyone had the worm light, right? You had to.
No, I never had any kind of lighting system.
Playing Raw at night, going by the street lights.
Don't say it like that. You're right though. Yeah, no, I never had like any kind of lighting system or magnification. Like again, my cousins did. My parents wanted to keep up with the Joneses with my aunts and my cousins, but not to that degree. So I never had any of the fancy attachments.
Yeah, the worm lights were pretty nice. There were all these. A lot of these peripherals were third party, right? So like, I think the printer, the camera, those were Nintendo, but all the lighting and like, so I have like a night sight, which is similar to the Handy Boy, but it's basically a magnifying glass that has these lights on the side that illuminate it. And it works pretty well. It's not perfect, but it's it's fun. It's cool. These little peripherals. I think they also have like the Handy Boy might have one of these as well. But there's like, the speakers on there. I think that is the Handy Boy, right? Where it's got a whole deal for the speakers and everything to up your sound. It's pretty wild.
Fold out. I think don't quote me on this, but I think the Handy Boy itself took batteries too.
Probably.
Boombox Boy was another one that I found today that I was unfamiliar with. It was basically an FM radio that plugged into the link cable slot. kind of cool for all you for all those elementary school kids in the early 2000s that wanted to listen to Froggy 98.3 or something.
I was going to say,
you could do that.
You want to hear the latest Will Smith album plugged into your Game Boy? There you go.
I wonder what the quality on these things are like. I wonder if I could find one.
Garbage.
Probably incredible, I'm guessing.
Yeah, one of the really cool things, I think, that it's accessory adjacent are some of the Game Boy games that have special things about the cartridge that make it make it special. So let me see, what are some good ones? I think there was, Kirby Tilt and Tumble is a cool one where it has I think they call them an accelerometer, but basically it made it so that when you actually tilt the Game Boy, there's movement for Kirby, which is pretty cool. And there's a handful of games that use that. I want to say WarioWare uses that as well. And then there's a Game Boy Advance game called Backlog that had a light sensor. And this game is wild. Like, it doesn't make any sense because the Game Boy Advance, we've been talking a lot about how without being backlit, you can't like play without good light, right? So you would think we play outside. Well, it turns out if the sun's too heavy, the screen doesn't look too great either. Mm-hmm. But this game in particular, you're fighting vampires and there's a light sensor, and the light sensor like catches the actual sunlight and lets you attack these vampires. So like it's like a really cool concept and a really cool idea. But in action, it just doesn't really work very well.
Yeah. Made by Hideo Kojima.
Yeah. Oh, it is. I didn't know that. That's cool.
Yeah. It's a Kojima game.
That checks out. Yeah.
This is all of this is news to me. But I'm not surprised at all to hear that it was a Kojima thing.
Yeah. And he's still bitter that it didn't sell well. Like, not too long ago, he went on like a thing on Twitter talking about how people didn't understand Boktai.
And there's like a trilogy. I want to say there's 3 of them.
Oh, jeez.
It's ahead of his time. And another peripheral that we haven't mentioned yet is the e-reader. So a lot of this stuff, it's pretty interesting, with the accelerometer deal, the rumble pack, and the e-reader. The e-reader allowed you to scan these barcodes, and it would, it's essentially like today's Amiibo. You would be able to scan these like little pieces of these cards or whatever, and it would let certain games get special items, which is pretty rad. So it's really interesting when you start looking at Nintendo's history and to see how they've pulled different kind of crazy ideas from each system and how they end up in some of their newer things.
Yeah. One thing that I remember kind of on that subject is Nintendo's been trying for a while to like integrate handheld and console, and it started with the Game Boy Advance. With the promise of using your Game Boy Advance as a controller for stuff going on the GameCube, which I never did. But I did import my Mario Golf and Mario Tennis players from those games into the GameCube games and Rec Shop. But, they tried again with the Wii U, and then now the Switch. So it started with the Game Boy Advance.
Yeah, one of the best implementations of that is one that I didn't really get to play with too much myself. But Wind Waker actually has that capability where if you link up your Game Boy Advance, a second player can control Tingle in the game, and it kind of helps link out like with different map items, and you can bomb things and whatnot.
Hell yeah!
But shout out to my boy Tingle.
Shout out to the boy Tingle. That's how every good podcast should aspire to do a transition. Mm-hmm. Folks, we've got a lot of listener responses, and I want to get to them. But before we do, I want to give our 2 guests here, my 2 wonderful friends, I want to give them a little platform to plug their shows and their socials, because I am a huge, huge fan of both of these shows. And I think if you like our show, you're going to like theirs as well. So, I was looking for a coin, but I don't have one handy. Which one of you guys wants to go first?
I'll go ahead and go first.
Kick it off, Dave.
So my show that'll be most relevant to Pixel Project Radio is Tales from the Backlog, which is a weekly gaming review show, but doing backlog games, not really new releases. And by the time you hear my episodes about new releases, it's backlog games by that point. So the thing about my show is that half of every episode is no spoilers, deep diving on whatever we can talk about with no spoilers, and then a hard kind of reset for everyone who hasn't played to stop listening if you don't want to be spoiled. So Rick has been on my show many times at this point. We talked about Disco Elysium. We talked about Yakuza Like a Dragon, Final Fantasy IX, I'm forgetting what else.
13 Sentinels.
13 Sentinels, yeah. So, for example, if you haven't played Disco Elysium, you can listen to, like, in that episode, like 2 hours of no spoiler stuff. That was a long one. And then tap out when the spoiler wall hits. So that's Tales from the Backlog. Alex has also been on the show. We talked about Red Dead Redemption 2. So, yeah, those are good places to start. I also do another show called A Top 3 Podcast, which is much simpler. It is top 3 lists, and it's a good time. So you can find either show by searching the show name in whatever social media or podcast app. Same logo for everything. Different handles, but I'm not going to list social media handles here. Just search Tales from the Backlog. I'm the only one, as far as I know. There can only be one. I took care of the rest. So that's my show.
Yeah, if any of you Scott the Woz fans are wondering about that, well, Dave just, listen, he took care of it.
Yeah, Scott hasn't done one of those episodes in several years now. I feel like it's my turf now.
There can only be one great Ohioan podcaster.
Uh-huh. Hey, y'all, Dave here.
Dave's also not an RPG guy. Alex, please tell the good people about Low 5.
Right on. Yeah. So my podcast is a monthly. We publish on the 15th of each month, and it is essentially a backlog book club format podcast that I do with my little brother Luke. And we cover game of the moment or just games that are deep in our backlog that we want to cross off the old backlog. So we spend we spend our month playing whatever game, trying to beat it, and then we get together and we talk about our experiences there. We always are brought to you in part by an unsanctioned sponsor, which is something or someone or whatever that we have no reason to be hawking at all, but we do it anyways. And then we finish with our side quests. So we talk about the other games that we've been playing that month, or other media, etc. And you can find Low 5 Gaming at low5gaming.com. So that's low 5, not high 5, but low 5 gaming. So that's low5gaming.com. There's links to all our socials, links to our Discord, etc. Everything Low 5 you can find there.
And I just want to second Low 5 Gaming is a fantastic show. And the fact that it's a monthly show means that I can actually play along with a book club because I got 1 month to play one game. And it's a real good time.
Yeah, here. Both shows are really, really terrific. Well, all three. We could throw a top 3 podcast in there too.
Oh, okay.
I'm a big fan. I'm genuinely a big fan of all three. Super high quality, really great. What's the word? Banter, but rapport with the guests. I mean, Alex and Luke have known each other their whole lives, which is cheating if you think about it.
Yeah,
but
kind of fucked up.
No, it's all super, super high quality stuff. You can find more information about them in the show notes, as always, and I will tag them on socials as well when I make my little posts. So thank you both again for joining me. Incredible stuff, and I'm glad that you're here.
Hey, thanks for having us, man.
You, man.
It's been great. It's fun. You say I appreciate all your kind words. I'll throw my little brother under the bus. He often will say. He just gets to show up and shoot, where I do all the editing and all that stuff. So it's fun for me to come and to show up and shoot, bud. So thanks for taking care of all the hard stuff today.
Show up and shoot. I like that. He's the movie star, and you are the director.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I put a call out to all of you fine folks listening, and probably a lot of fine folks who aren't listening because life happens. For all of your favorite Game Boy memories. I left it very open-ended. You could tell me about your favorite games, favorite memory, etc. And boy howdy did we get more responses than I was expecting. We've got just a couple from Instagram, but then Twitter is where it really blew up. So I'm going to enlist the aid of Dave and Alex to read some of these listener responses. And we're going to start with Instagram because there's less of it there. And I'll get us started here. My good friend Matt Altamir. Here's what he says. He says, and sorry, Matt, but by the way, we will react to some of these and not to others. It just depends on if we've, talked about some of this stuff already, so please don't be offended if we don't do like 10 minutes on each answer. Anyways, Matt, here's what Matt says. Pokemon Yellow on Game Boy Color. Getting to play out the most accurate version of Ash's story from the anime in the video game was something really special. Here, Pokemon Yellow was, oh man, it's monumental.
After the struggle in Red and Blue, trading and bargaining to try and get all the starters, the fact that you could get all of them in Yellow was so cool.
And Dave, you mentioned earlier in the episode, but they had that the Game Boy Color Pokemon Yellow Special Edition, which was pretty rad.
Yeah. Yep.
Let's go to Alex next. Alex, do you want to tell us what Brad Warwick has to say?
Yeah, so Brad said Wario Land 3 and Pokemon Yellow were my childhood.
Here. Wario Land 3.
Checks out, bud.
Awesome game.
I know Brad personally. I have seen his Yellow Edition Game Boy in person.
Jealous.
Dave, you want to tell us what Eric has to say?
Yeah, Eric. Shout out to Eric. Eric says, Game Boy Advance! Exclamation point. A lot of my all-time favorites are on the GBA. The Intelligent Systems games were big. Fire Emblem and Advance Wars are all-time great. Agree. Those GBA Fire Emblem games are tough as nails. So props.
And speaking of Fire Emblem, we've got Alejandro. Eric, by the way, is host of the Unlockables podcast, great show. And Alejandro is host of a Random Gamers Corner, another great show. And he has to say, Fire Emblem Blazing Blade, my true gateway drug to the series. If you've ever been in their Discord, you know how massive of a fan he is of Fire Emblem.
Yeah, and that's, again, if you haven't played Blazing Blade or Sacred Stones, the GBA Fire Emblem games, they're so hard. It's not like me, where I'm like, yeah, my gateway was Fire Emblem Three Houses, one of the easier games that I played. They're like, no, they cut their teeth on the hard ones.
For sure. Alex, you want to take us into the Twitter land?
Yes, sir. So the next one comes from Bakul?
Your guess is as good as mine.
Right on. Our boy Bakul. My favorite Game Boy game is Donkey Kong. It takes the original arcade game and builds on it to make one of my favorite puzzle platformers.
Yes, I feel like I'm going like the sicko mode. Like, yes.
That's one because of all the talk between you, Rick, and now Bakiel, moving up my list of Game Boy games to play. Next up is Nomad from Retro Wildlands podcast. Nomad says, I took my Game Boy on a camping trip of all things and came across another kid. I had Pokemon Red, he had Pokemon Blue, and we battled. I barely won, but for someone who grew up as an only child, I love that. The Game Boy was the first system that allowed me to play with others. And yeah, that's awesome.
And that kid grew up to be Barack Obama.
I love that he got to have that trainer battle experience in real life.
Yeah.
Like, a random
they locked
kid
eyes
camping.
and they were like, we have to fight. That's how it works.
Oh, I also I have fond memories of, I went on a camping trip up. I'm from Minnesota, so the what would it be? Lake Itasca, Itasca State Park up here. It's in northern Minnesota. But I went there on a camping trip with my dad and some friends of the family, and me and my buddy Ezra. We obviously enjoyed nature, but we also enjoyed playing his Game Boy in nature.
That is just terrific. We've got another one here from Moon, new friend of the show, terrific dude, awesome YouTube channel, Triple S Moon. Go check it out. Here's what Moon has to say. Game Boy Advance is arguably my favorite game console / handheld of all time. Picking a favorite is way too hard, but it's probably Mega Man 0, 3, or 4. I also love Kirby and the Amazing Mirror, the weirdest Metroidvania, Metroid Fusion, and Castlevania Harmony of Dissonance.
Those are some top tier games.
Yep.
No kidding.
Yeah. Should we jump on to Chris?
Yeah, let's go to Chris.
Chris from A Novel Console. Grew up playing Pokemon by Streetlight. Spent my teens with Castlevania, Dragon Ball Z, and Mega Man, all on the GBA. The Game Boy name truly has an incomparable legacy. Can't argue with that. Another good grouping of games, too.
Yeah, those Dragon Ball Z games on Game Boy were seriously underrated.
Yeah, and speaking of Mega Man, I mean, Moon mentioned Mega Man 0, 3 and 4, but for me, Mega Man Battle Network was my introduction to Mega Man on the Game Boy Advance. Battle Network 1, 2, and 3, I think I played all of those. Never beat any of them because they're ridiculous games, but I loved them up until the point where I quit.
They're like an RPG Mega Man, right?
Yeah, they're RPGs,
RPG
and they have
mechanics,
this weird, like, real-time, like, grid-based combat with like these ability cards and stuff. It's a real weird battle system that no one ever tried again until like 3 or 4 years ago. And next is Stew World Order. Stew World Order says Pokemon Crystal! Exclamation point. I played that over and over and over back in the day. Stew World Order, I played that over and over and over back in the day too. Fucking love that game.
That game was the first Pokemon game that allowed you to choose your gender at the beginning, which is pretty rad for all the, I don't know, it gave some agency to folks playing. I think that's really cool.
Yeah. And unfortunately, that's the generation of Pokemon that had like the clocks built into the cartridges. So a lot of those old ones don't work anymore, which sucks.
Right. And Crystal goes for like $120 roughly these days, I want to say.
Damn. Yeah, that's crazy. I like the clocks at the time. They just haven't aged well because, time. All right, next up we've got Jala, new friend of the show. Jala from a podcast that I'm a fan of called The Level and also Jala's Place. She says, my favorite GBA game is Shining Force Resurrection of the Dark Dragon, which is, in my opinion, the best version of the first Shining Force game. But I had the most vivid memories of Metroid Fusion. I was in college full-time and working full-time when it came out, and I was glued to my tiny GBA around that. It had notable body horror elements to it that drew me in. More on that in a Jala ep in a Jala ep. It is a Jala ep. In a July ep of Jala-chan's Place. I was stuck to Metroid Fusion the same way I was stuck on Morrowind. High praise.
Yeah.
High praise.
Little tease to check out that July episode about Metroid Fusion. Your boy Dave will be
Metroid Fusion
there.
is one of my favorite games of all time. It's
oh shit!
It's hard to deny.
Sorry,
Zero
what was
Mission
that,
as
Alex?
well. I was just saying that Metroid Fusion is one of my favorite games of all time and is what made me fall in love with Metroid.
Yep. It was my first Metroid game. I loved it back then.
Yep. And if anybody is Metroid curious and kind of want to start at the beginning, Metroid Zero Mission for the Game Boy Advance is a great start.
Yep.
Awesome. Alex, what does Chris Copeline have to say?
Chris says, I remember playing a ton of it when we would go up to a cabin in the northern Wisconsin when I was younger. Mega Man, Monopoly, and Ultra Golf were the titles I'd always play. Good times. Those are a couple that I haven't actually played. Ultra Golf, I'm going to have to see if I can get my hands on that one.
I bet it rips. It's a golf game.
I know,
Golf games
I know,
rip.
man. I'm with you.
It's a well-established fact.
Chris crazy for how much he loves Mega Man, man.
Yeah.
Mega Man's tough.
Oh, yeah. Hey, and shout out, before we move on, shout out to Retro Hangover, of which Chris Copeline is one of the two co-hosts.
Yeah, fantastic. Next up, speaking of fantastic, Josh, host of the Still Loading podcast. Josh says, I used to play Pokemon Blue on long car rides as a kid. We would drive out to Amish country, hell yeah, which was like an hour and a half to 2 hours away, and I would play the whole time. Yeah, a lot of my memories playing all the Game Boys up until the SP, when you got that backlight, was in the car, couple seconds every street light, try and guess what's going on until the next street light. Hell yeah.
Oh yeah. We my family didn't take many vacations as a kid, but we when I was a kid, when we drove down to Busch Gardens in Virginia, my entire trip was populated by my Game Boy with probably Pokemon Red or Gold, I can't remember. That, a Digimon book that I got at the Scholastic Book Fair, and my CD player that had, now that's what I call music volume, like 15.
That was a beautiful time capsule right there.
Yeah. Speaking of Pokemon, real quick, the first midnight release I ever went to was for Pokemon Gold and Silver, and we begged our parents to take us to the mall at midnight to get it on a school night, and whatever we did, or however loud we were begging, it worked.
Bullying works once again. Next up from Twitter, we've got Hopple, who keeps it short, sweet, and to the point. Tetris.
Goat material.
Can't argue with that.
Here.
Unless you're Luke. Clown.
Oh, love it. Dogface Gamer. I remember playing Donkey Kong Land on the Game Boy and being blown away at how quality it was. First time playing a handheld title that felt like a big console release. Made me excited for the future of handhelds.
Yeah, well said.
Hell
well
yeah.
said. Dogface Gamer on Twitch. Good Twitch channel.
Yeah. Next up is Captain Madman. Captain Madman says, Solar Striker! Exclamation point. I always refer to this game for these Game Boy questions. I never played an arcade shooter before this, and the Game Boy was the first console I owned, not the family's Coleco or my brother's Sega Master System. I will always remember Solar Striker. I have never heard of Solar Striker. It sounds cool.
Yeah, neither have I.
I've heard of it, but it's not the one that I've tackled yet. This is fun. I'm gonna have a couple on my list.
Yeah, got some homework now. And we're closing it out with Aaron from the Superpod Saga, bringing it home with two heavies. He says Legend of the River King 2 on Game Boy Color and Golden Sun on the GBA.
Golden Sun was one that I loved. Final Fantasy VI was my first RPG on the GBA. Golden Sun was my second, and I loved it. And it's one that I'm eager to revisit. Also going on NSO, as far as I know.
Hey, looky there. That's great news. All right, well, everybody, thank you for writing in. That was a tremendous amount of responses, and you love to see it, or I love to see it. We all love to see it. Let's be honest. If you want to respond to any future questions such as this, the most reliable place to do that is in the Pixel Project Radio Discord. But as you can see here, we outsource all the time to Twitter and Instagram. So keep an eye on us there. You will find links to both of those, Twitter, Instagram, as well as Discord, in the show notes. You'll also find a link to our Patreon page. Folks, I'm not going to lie to you. I'm fond of money. I like it. I'm into it. And if you like all this dumb rambling that I do, you can check out patreon.com/pixelprojectradio, where you can see a host of tiers as well as some little bonus goodies that you get for signing up. And once again, too, I just want to say that all of the Low 5 and Tales from the Backlog / a top 3 stuff will be in the episode show notes as well. So you'll be able to find all of their stuff and go check them out, which I highly, highly recommend you do, because they're great shows. They're great dudes. And I've just had a blast talking with them, and we hope that you've had a blast listening.
Yeah, this has been great. Thank you again, Rick. Alex, always good to talk with you too, man.
Yeah, you too, fellas. Always a pleasure catching up.
It's good stuff. And on that note, we are going to switch the power off because my batteries need replenishing. So, folks, for now, my name is Rick. For now and for always, my name is Rick. I have no plans to change it. I will see you all next time. Thanks for tuning in. Signing off for now. Take care.